In 1846, the Massachusetts House of Representatives appropriated $2,500 to establish an experimental school for mentally handicapped individuals. Originally located in South Boston and run by Samuel Gridley Howe, the Massachusetts School for the Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Youth began as a moral and religious initiative to make productive citizens out of high-functioning disabled boys. In 1887, under pressure from the state to expand its enrollment, the school bought an 18-acre campus in Waltham. Walter E. Fernald was named the superintendent of the new campus in 1887 and would spend the next 25 years growing it into what was then the most crowded institution in the United States. Fernald was initially a proponent of eugenics and advocated for the separation or sterilization of people whom he deemed to be intellectually inferior. In his own words, Fernald believed that, quote, "the results of eugenic research are so impressive that we are almost convinced that we are in the possession of knowledge which would enable us to markedly diminish the number of the feeble-minded in a few generations if segregation or surgical sterilization of all known defectives were possible," end quote.
I think he was very worried about people passing down disabilities to the next generation, and he was worried that could just lead to chronic trouble for families and chronic trouble for people. And I think he did worry about it from a humane standpoint.
Due in part to Fernald's concerns about the dangers of people with intellectual disabilities reproducing, and in part to public pressure, fewer students were being released and returned to the community.
But he has a real problem with Howe's idea that people can go home. And the reason he has a problem with that idea is that people used to be able to go home because people didn't move around much. And by 1887, when Fernald comes to run the school, people don't stay in the town they were from. And Fernald is deeply worried that in that kind of world, people with disabilities don't have somewhere to go home. And to be able to get the money from the state to grow his school, he makes a large series of agreements with the state that force him to take in people with levels and kinds of disability that Howe would never have accepted into the school.
This marked a transformation from the original vision of a day school to a place where children were institutionalized, in some cases permanently. After Fernald's death in 1924, the school officially changed its name to the Walter E. Fernald State School, and it continued to exceed capacity and degrade conditions for its residents. Slowly, time allotted for the education of the boys became time spent performing manual labor, and temporary stays became permanent ones. The school also began to admit a significant percentage of non-disabled students and utilize those children as a free labor force. One such boy who was admitted in mid-20th century was Fred Boyce. In a 60-minute story, he recounted his harrowing experiences at Fernald. When asked why he may have been placed in the home, Fred guessed,
"It was the easy way out. They didn't have to look for homes for you, so they could just dump you off in these human warehouses and just let you rot, And that's what they did. They let us rot."
Fred Boyce was falsely labeled feeble-minded by the state of Massachusetts and was kept at Fernald for 11 years. Fred also recalled punishment for failed escape attempts.
The kids were taken here to the infamous Ward 22, the school's detention center.
Couldn't escape, This was the prison.
Fred was locked up in solitary confinement here.
And they had a little mattress on the floor there.
As a further humiliation, kids were stripped naked. Back then, the windows had bars.
Most shocking, however, is the fact that many of these boys were subjected, without their consent, to science experiments performed by MIT staff, funded by Quaker Oats, and sponsored by the Fernald State School. Boys were asked to join a science club, where the experiments were disguised behind preferential treatment. Joe Almeida, a member of the club, recalls the benefits.
We were getting special treatment, extra dessert. We got to eat away from the other boys. We were getting extra oatmeal, getting extra milk.
Through investigation of these experiments, the Massachusetts Task Force found 2 separate consent letters that were sent to parents seeking permission for their child's participation in nutrition studies and occasional blood drawings, but there was no mention of risks or use of radioisotopes. The task force located only half of the 74 boys involved in the nutrition experiments, but they recommended that all participants were entitled to compensation. However, experts decided that the experiments would not have caused permanent health problems. World War II would unintentionally serve to ignite a reform movement that ultimately altered the treatment and perception of people with intellectual disabilities as a result of women playing larger roles in their communities. This newfound empowerment galvanized Fernald families because Mother of Residents now began to demand visitation. In 1950, the National Association of Parents and Friends of Mentally Retarded Children was founded. Families band together to support each other and effect change in policy. In 1961, ARC joined with television cowboy Rex Traylor, a passionate advocate for children with intellectual disabilities, in a covered wagon march across Massachusetts to the State House to advocate for improved legal rights for the disabled. Similarly, in 1970, Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded the Shriver Center on the Fernald campus with a mission to improve the lives of people with intellectual and physical disabilities. Through the advocacy by numerous public figures, individuals with mental and physical disabilities were slowly given a voice and the rights they deserved. At last, the mistreatment of institutionalized individuals was under public scrutiny, and the Walter E. Fernald State School would be no exception. The grassroots efforts to improve the lives of disabled children finally resulted in significant changes in the law. In 1972, a class action lawsuit was filed against Belchertown State School, an institution similar to Fernald, on behalf of patients alleging that conditions at the school were so inadequate that they violated their constitutional rights. Lawsuits against 4 other institutions across Massachusetts followed, including one against the Fernald School.
The theory of our lawsuit in the beginning was, if you're essentially going to incarcerate people for having done nothing wrong, then you have to provide them with the care and treatment that's appropriate to their need.
The 5 cases were then consolidated under the case Ricky v. Oken, and U.S. District Court Judge Joseph Toro was assigned. Upon visiting Fernald, Belchertown, and the other schools, Toro decided that, quote, for too many years, the retarded citizens of Massachusetts were benignly permitted to exist in filth and squalor, end quote, and described these institutions as pig pens and human warehouses. On many occasions, the plaintiff lawyers visited the schools. Nani Burns recalls one visit to Waltham State School.
The men's wards, and it was really astonishing. It was like a kennel. Really, the door was locked, and when we came to the door, they all kind of sort of ran over or crawled over. They had no clothes on. Oh. The place really smelled horrible.
Additional investigative task forces concluded that the schools were not attaining a constitutional level of care and conditions were intolerable. The governor of Massachusetts at the time, Michael Dukakis, was also appalled by what he saw when he visited.
75 severely disabled boys, half of them naked, sitting on in their own excrement on a concrete floor, rocking back and forth all morning long with 2 attendants. That's the way we dealt with kids with disabilities.
Judge Toro pressured the parties to enter into consent decrees that required the defendant schools to meet the needs of each resident by providing direct care deemed adequate by the Department of Public Health. They would also regulate staffing levels, improve overall living conditions, and require the transition from institution-like facilities. Toro eventually withdrew as overseer of the decrees, but over the next 2 decades, the judge would repeatedly be asked to intervene in attempts to reduce staffing levels, and later when the state attempted to close down the Fernald School. In 1993, Toro formed a citizen task force with the responsibility to ensure that the system of services for people with mental retardation never regresses to the deplorable and degrading conditions of the past. Nani Burns believes the results of the lawsuit created a monumental shift in the lives of people with intellectual disabilities in Massachusetts.
It's in the sense that people met these people, they saw them, they knew they weren't scary, they weren't freaks, they were people who were just a little bit different and needed different help to succeed.
The treatment of intellectually impaired children at the Fernald School was abhorrent and indefensible, but a series of civil suits brought about changes that dramatically improved the care and education of students at the Fernald School and heralded changes for all disabled students in Massachusetts public schools. In part because of the lawsuit, increased attention was given to special education. Prior to 1975, public schools did not offer resources for children with disabilities. The added social stigma around children with intellectual disabilities restricted their exposure in society.
Parents kept them home. They institutionalized them, or they might have been hospitalized. And you had to convince them, it's okay, come on out, come to the school. But before that, the law didn't require them to.
Through the tireless work of advocates across the country, the United States Congress in 1975 passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which guaranteed every child the right to a seat in public schools. However, their work was not done. Schools had difficulty locating students with disabilities, and when they were found and offered a seat in school, parents often declined. But after Ricky v. Oken, families brought their children home from institutions in large numbers, and society was much more open to their reintroduction to their communities. Gradually, schools grew their special education programs, and the law enforced every child's attendance in school. Over the decades leading into the 21st century, the Commonwealth downsized Fernald, relocating able residents to other state facilities, and shut it down entirely in 2014. Unable to pass a successful proposal for new use of the property, the state of Massachusetts sold the 200-acre parcel to the city of Waltham in 2014 for $3.7 million. The ultimate legacy of the Fernald State School came from the lawsuit that provided a voice for the marginalized and often forgotten population.